There comes a moment when the heart that has carried the pain of others finally whispers, "Enough." And in that silence, every false mask crumbles, revealing what was hidden all along. There is a silent suffering carried by those who forgive too much. It is a suffering invisible to the world because it wears the disguise of nobility. Society applauds the one who is endlessly forgiving, who bends without breaking, who offers a smile even after betrayal. Such a soul is praised as saintly, selfless, and pure. Yet beneath this mask of virtue there lies a heavy burden. For forgiveness, when given without limit or discernment, ceases to be an act of strength and becomes instead a slow erosion of the self. To forgive is human. It is the bridge that allows broken bonds to mend, a gesture of healing that releases both the giver and the receiver. But what becomes of the heart that must forgive the same wound again and again? What happens to the spirit when forgiveness is no longer a choice but an expectation? In that moment, the gift of forgiveness transforms into a prison, binding the empath to cycles of harm they never created but are forced to carry. The world does not often recognize this prison, for it sees only the surface. People admire the one who forgives endlessly because it relieves them of the discomfort of accountability. The one who forgives becomes the safe harbor for those who would otherwise confront the storm of their own conscience. The liar, the betrayer, the manipulator. They thrive not because of their strength, but because someone else is willing to absorb their shadow. Endless forgiveness becomes the fertile soil in which deceit and exploitation grow unchecked. The burden here is not only emotional, it is existential. The person who forgives without boundaries slowly loses contact with their own essence. Their yes becomes automatic, their no buried deep in the unconscious. They begin to confuse compassion with self-sacrifice, kindness with submission. The self is forced into silence, for each act of forgiveness demands a small piece of it to be surrendered. Over time, the inner voice grows faint, replaced by the clamoring demands of others who have learned that they will always be pardoned. And yet, there is another dimension to this burden. The one who forgives endlessly must also carry the hidden anger, the unspoken resentment, the quiet grief of being unseen. They cannot express it, for to reveal their exhaustion would disrupt the image of the ever-giving soul. They smile while bleeding. They console while crumbling. They listen while no one listens back. This duality tears them apart. Outwardly the picture of patience, inwardly the reservoir of silent suffering. It is not forgiveness itself that wounds, it is the absence of balance. Forgiveness, when it comes from strength, is liberating. It acknowledges pain, yet chooses release. But forgiveness without recognition of boundaries is a distortion. It no longer serves healing, it enables destruction. To forgive endlessly is to allow the offender to remain blind to their own shadow, to shield them from the consequences that would otherwise awaken their conscience. In this way, the empath who never stops forgiving does not only betray themselves, they also betray truth. The psyche knows this betrayal, even if the conscious mind denies it. Somewhere deep within, the soul grows restless, whispering that something is wrong. Dreams may speak in symbols of imprisonment, suffocation, or drowning. Anxiety may surface not as weakness, but as the psyche's rebellion against self-erasure. The unconscious refuses to cooperate with endless submission. It insists that the self must not be forever sacrificed on the altar of another's comfort. And so, the empath lives in tension, torn between the desire to remain loving and the growing realization that their love has become a shield for deception. They fear that to stop forgiving would make them unkind, cruel, or heartless. Yet in truth, it is the opposite. To stop forgiving without limit is to allow forgiveness to return to its rightful place, an act of conscious choice, not compulsion. It is to restore dignity both to the self and to the act itself. The burden of endless forgiveness is, at its core, the burden of carrying other people's shadows. It is the weight of lies excused, betrayals softened, cruelties dismissed. Each act of pardon is a brick, and over time the empath finds themselves crushed beneath a wall they never chose to build. What the world sees as strength is often nothing more than survival, the quiet endurance of a spirit that has forgotten its own boundaries. The tragedy is that those who carry this burden often do so out of love. They believe that by forgiving endlessly, they are protecting the bond, preserving the relationship, maintaining harmony. But harmony built on self-erasure is an illusion. It is a peace that demands silence in the face of harm, a balance maintained by the suffering of one so that others may remain unchallenged. This is not true harmony, it is suppression disguised as virtue. Yet, within this burden lies the seed of awakening. For no one can carry the weight of endless forgiveness forever. The psyche, in its wisdom, eventually rebels. The empath reaches a threshold, a moment when the pain of self-betrayal outweighs the fear of change. At that moment, forgiveness without balance dies, and in its place arises a new clarity. It is a clarity that does not hate, but no longer tolerates exploitation. It does not seek revenge, but no longer shields others from truth. The empath realizes then that the most profound act of love is not endless pardon, but authenticity. To forgive with discernment, to say no when no is sacred, to allow others to face the consequences of their actions. This is love matured, compassion purified, and though the world may no longer see them as endlessly merciful, they have, in truth, become something far greater, a soul who has reclaimed its wholeness, even at the cost of false peace. Every human soul carries within it an invisible boundary, a point beyond which it can no longer endure deception, exploitation, or the slow erosion of dignity. This inner boundary is not easily seen by others, nor is it always recognized by the one who carries it. For a long time, it may remain hidden, buried beneath layers of patience, compassion, and silence. Yet it exists, like a line drawn deep in the psyche, waiting for the moment when it must be honored. This is the sacred threshold. The empath often lives close to this threshold without realizing it. Their nature is to give, to understand, to forgive. They move through life with the belief that love can heal all things, that patience can soften even the hardest hearts. They extend themselves again and again, tolerating behaviors that others would refuse, excusing betrayals, justifying manipulations, absorbing wounds. It seems endless, this reservoir of mercy, but it is not. Every act of tolerance carries a weight, and every overlooked wound presses closer toward the threshold where something shifts irrevocably. At first, the empath resists this truth. They fear the consequences of reaching their limit. To imagine saying enough feels like a betrayal of their own identity. They have always been the one who understands, the one who bends, the one who gives without condition. To set a boundary feels unnatural, even cruel, and yet the psyche cannot be deceived forever. There comes a moment when the soul revolts against its own suppression, when the quiet whisper of self-respect grows louder than the demands of others. This moment is rarely dramatic to the outside world. Often, it is not marked by shouting nor by anger. Instead, it is a silent clarity, a stillness that feels almost sacred. The empath, who once endured endlessly, suddenly recognizes that to continue forgiving without balance is to betray themselves. In that instant, the sacred threshold is crossed, not outwardly against another, but inwardly in favor of the self. It is the moment when the soul reclaims its voice. The power of this threshold lies in its transformative force. Those who once leaned upon the empath's softness, who took their forgiveness for granted, are shaken when it is withdrawn. Masks fall, pretenses collapse, and the true dynamics of the relationship are revealed. What had long been hidden beneath the veil of forgiveness is suddenly exposed. Without the empath's compliance, the manipulator must face the reality of their own behavior. The absence of endless pardon becomes a mirror in which the truth can no longer be denied. This is why the threshold is sacred. It is not merely a psychological limit, it is a spiritual awakening. It marks the point where love ceases to be a form of self-erasure and becomes instead a balanced force rooted in truth. To reach this threshold is to realize that authentic compassion cannot exist without self-respect. Forgiveness loses its meaning when it becomes automatic, when it demands nothing of the other, when it shields them from the consequences of their own shadow. True forgiveness is born only after responsibility is acknowledged, after wounds are honored, after dignity is preserved. The one who arrives at this threshold discovers a paradox. What feels like the end of compassion is, in reality, its rebirth. No longer is love confused with submission. No longer is kindness equated with silence. Instead, love is reclaimed as a conscious choice, extended not because it is demanded, but because it is deserved. The empath learns that to deny endless pardon is not cruelty, it is truth-telling. And truth, though uncomfortable, is the foundation upon which authentic connection must rest. Crossing the threshold does not mean the empath becomes unloving. On the contrary, they become more loving, for their compassion is now directed both outward and inward. They no longer offer care to others at the expense of themselves. They no longer protect the illusions of those who refuse growth. Instead, they embody a love that is fierce in its honesty, a love that demands reciprocity, a love that honors both the self and the other. This is the birth of a deeper wholeness, a reconciliation of strength and tenderness. To the outside world, this transformation may appear sudden. Those accustomed to the empath's endless forgiveness are often startled by the change. They may accuse them of being cold, distant, or unforgiving. Yet these accusations reveal more about the accuser than the empath. For it is not cruelty that has emerged, but clarity. The empath has simply ceased to provide shelter for deception. They have stepped into the light of their own truth, and in doing so, they have forced others to face theirs. What makes this threshold sacred is that it cannot be forced, nor can it be faked. It arises organically, often after years of endurance, after countless internal struggles. It is the culmination of the psyche's demand for balance, the moment when the unconscious finally insists upon integration. In reaching it, the empath does not abandon their nature, they fulfill it. For to be truly compassionate is not to endlessly forgive, but to love in a way that does not deny truth, to care in a way that does not destroy the self. This awakening is not without pain. To step across the threshold is to watch certain illusions die. Relationships built on exploitation may collapse. Bonds maintained by silence may dissolve. The empath may feel grief, loss, even guilt. But beneath this sorrow lies freedom. The soul, once burdened by endless pardon, is now free to breathe, free to love with discernment, free to live without chains. This freedom is not born from bitterness, but from authenticity. It is the quiet strength of one who has finally chosen themselves, not against the world, but within it. There comes a moment in every relationship where the truth, long hidden behind appearances, begins to break through. Human beings are masters of disguise, skilled at presenting themselves as they wish to be seen rather than as they truly are. The smile that hides resentment, the charm that conceals manipulation, the words of affection that mask selfish intent, all are part of the endless theater of masks that people wear. These masks serve a purpose. They allow individuals to move through the world with acceptance, to avoid confrontation with their own shadows, to control how others perceive them. But these masks are fragile, and when the empath ceases to forgive endlessly, when they withdraw the silent permission that has long sustained illusion, the masks begin to crumble. For as long as the empath continues to pardon without question, the mask remains secure. The deceiver, the betrayer, the manipulator can rely on the gentle soul to absorb their faults and cover their contradictions. Forgiveness, when it is blind and boundless, becomes a shelter where dishonesty thrives. But the moment that forgiveness is withheld, the mask loses its anchor. The false self that once stood so confidently begins to tremble. Without the empath's compliance, without the cushion of endless pardon, the truth can no longer be concealed. The mask cracks, and through the fracture emerges the hidden face. The crumbling of masks is rarely gentle. It is often violent, for those who have lived behind them feel exposed, even endangered, when the illusion collapses. They may grow defensive, angry, or desperate, attempting to repair the facade that once deceived so easily. They accuse the empath of being unkind, of changing, of no longer being the same. Yet what has changed is not the empath, but the stage upon which the performance was allowed to continue. By refusing to play the role of the silent forgiver, the empath withdraws the energy that sustained the masquerade, and suddenly the actor is forced to face their true reflection. Masks crumble because they are never real. They are projections, crafted from fear, pride, and the desire for control. They cover wounds that the wearer is unwilling to confront and hide impulses they refuse to acknowledge. Yet when faced with the firm boundary of one who no longer excuses or erases, the mask cannot endure. The pressure of truth is too great, and in its presence, the fragile scaffolding of illusion collapses. This moment of exposure is both terrifying and liberating. For the one whose mask has broken, it is terrifying because it reveals what they have long denied. The shadow they sought to hide is suddenly visible, not only to others, but to themselves. Yet it is also an opportunity for liberation, for no soul can live authentically while clinging to deception. The collapse of the mask is a crisis, but it is also an invitation to step into wholeness, to accept both light and shadow, to be known not for the performance, but for the truth of being. For the empath, witnessing this crumbling can be painful. To see someone they once forgave repeatedly now stand bare in their deceit is to confront disillusionment. The charm that once captivated, the tenderness that once seemed genuine, all of it reveals its hollowness. There is grief in this realization, grief for the image that was loved, for the bond that was never real, for the trust that was misplaced. Yet within this grief lies clarity. The empath learns that their compassion must no longer be offered to masks, but to truth. They discover that love cannot be given to illusions. It must be anchored in what is authentic, even if that authenticity is dark. The crumbling of masks is not only an interpersonal revelation, it is also symbolic of the greater psychological process every soul must undergo. Each person wears masks, even the empath. The difference is that the empath often sacrifices their own truth beneath a mask of endless patience. When they withdraw from automatic forgiveness, they too confront their own disguises. They recognize that their role as the eternal forgiver was itself a mask, a defense against abandonment, rejection, or conflict. To step into authenticity is to allow not only the masks of others to fall, but one's own as well. What emerges in this mutual unmasking is reality, raw, unpolished, often uncomfortable, yet profoundly human. Without masks, people can no longer manipulate one another with illusions. The empath can no longer be deceived by rehearsed charm, and the offender can no longer hide behind carefully constructed excuses. In this unveiled space, relationships are either reborn in honesty or collapse under the weight of their own falsehood. The beauty of this collapse is that it reveals what was always there but unseen. It uncovers motives, desires, fears, and truths that had been carefully hidden. And though painful, it is through this revelation that real transformation becomes possible. For it is only when the mask shatters that the soul has the chance to look itself in the eye, to reckon with its shadow, and to choose a different way of being. The empath, by no longer forgiving endlessly, becomes the catalyst of this transformation. They are not the destroyer of relationships, as they are often accused, but the revealer of truth. They do not create the crumbling of masks, they simply refuse to hold them in place. In doing so, they honor not only themselves, but also the deeper potential of the other, for only in truth can healing and growth occur. And so, when the empath stops forgiving without limit, the world of illusions shatters. The stage is dismantled, the actors stripped of their costumes, the lights turned on. What remains is reality, sometimes harsh, sometimes tender, but always authentic. This is the sacred moment when masks fall, when the theater ends, and when souls must choose whether to remain in denial or to step courageously into truth. There is no instrument in human relationships more powerful, more unsettling, and more transformative than the mirror of truth. It is not a mirror of glass and silver, but one made of presence, silence, and refusal. When the empath ceases to forgive endlessly, they hold up such a mirror. No longer shielding others from the weight of their actions, no longer absorbing the shadows that belong to someone else, they allow reality to be reflected back in its raw and unsoftened form. In that reflection, illusions die and the truth demands to be seen. For a long time, the empath prevents this mirror from appearing. Out of compassion, they absorb the pain, excuse the betrayal, and polish the image of the other so it appears more bearable. They take responsibility for maintaining harmony, for soothing conflict, for protecting the bond at all costs. In doing so, they shield the other from themselves. The liar is not confronted with their dishonesty. The manipulator does not face their selfishness. The betrayer does not experience the true consequence of betrayal. The empath becomes the cushion that softens every blow of reality, and as long as this continues, the mirror of truth remains hidden. But there comes a moment when the empath's soul rebels. The endless cycle of pardon collapses beneath its own weight, and suddenly the mirror is revealed. To stand before this mirror is unbearable for many because it strips away all disguise. It shows the one who has relied on forgiveness not as they wish to be seen, but as they truly are. No performance can hide it, no charm can distort it, no excuse can soften it. The mirror of truth reflects the shadow directly, and for the first time, the person must see themselves without the protection of illusion. This experience is often met with resistance. Few can bear to look into the mirror of truth without flinching. The one confronted may grow defensive, accusing the empath of cruelty or change. They may lash out, deny, project blame, or attempt to reassert the old dynamic where forgiveness was automatic. But no matter how they resist, the reflection remains. The empath has withdrawn their compliance, and without it, the mask is no longer sustainable. The mirror does not lie, it cannot lie, it simply reveals. For the empath, holding up this mirror is both painful and necessary. They have long avoided it, fearing that truth might destroy the relationship, that confrontation might lead to abandonment, that honesty might appear unkind. Yet, in avoiding the mirror, they betrayed themselves and trapped the other in cycles of unconsciousness. To finally reveal the truth is not an act of cruelty, but of authenticity. It allows the empath to reclaim their dignity and, paradoxically, gives the other a chance to awaken. For no soul can grow while shielded from its own shadow. The mirror of truth is ruthless, but it is also sacred. It does not condemn, it simply reflects. And what it reflects is not only the darkness, but the potential for light. When one sees themselves as they truly are, flawed, wounded, manipulative, or selfish, they are also given the chance to choose differently. The reflection becomes a turning point, a moment of crisis that can lead either to further denial or to genuine transformation. In this way, the empath, by refusing endless pardon, becomes the catalyst of growth not only for themselves, but for the other as well. There is a strange irony here. The very act the empath feared, that withholding forgiveness would be harmful, is revealed to be the very act that can heal. Endless pardon enabled deception, but the mirror of truth exposes it. Endless compassion protected illusion, but the mirror shatters it. Endless patience postponed awakening, but the mirror demands it now. What once seemed like love was in fact avoidance, and what now feels like confrontation is in fact the deeper form of love, the love that insists upon reality. Yet it must be understood. Not all who are shown the mirror will accept it. Some will turn away, refusing to face what they see. They will cling to their illusions, rebuild their masks, or abandon the relationship altogether rather than confront themselves. The empath must accept this possibility without guilt, for the purpose of the mirror is not to control the outcome, but to reveal. Whether one chooses to face their reflection or flee from it is beyond the empath's power. Their task is only to stop shielding, to stop carrying, to let the truth stand clear. For the empath themselves, the mirror also reveals something deeper. In refusing to endlessly forgive, they discover the value of their own boundaries, the dignity of their own soul. They realize that love does not mean distorting reality to protect others. It means standing firmly in truth, even if that truth disrupts false peace. By holding the mirror steady, they see not only the other more clearly but also themselves. They see the strength they did not know they had, the courage to face discomfort, and the authenticity that can no longer be silenced. The mirror of truth, once revealed, changes everything. It alters relationships, dismantles illusions, and forces choices that can no longer be postponed. Some bonds will fall away, for they were never built on authenticity. Others may grow stronger, purified by honesty and freed from disguise. But in every case, the mirror restores balance. It ensures that love is no longer one-sided, that compassion is no longer exploitation, that forgiveness is no longer compulsion. This mirror, then, is the empath's gift to the world, not a gentle gift, not one wrapped in comfort, but one wrapped in necessity. For in its reflection lies the possibility of awakening, the chance to step out of shadow and into wholeness. And though many will resist it, and some will hate it, the mirror of truth remains the only path to authenticity, the only ground upon which real connection can be built. There is a part of the human soul that most would rather not see. It is the place where repressed desires, unacknowledged fears, hidden resentments, and forbidden impulses reside. This part of the psyche, kept out of sight and away from the conscious self, is what we call the shadow. People spend their lives constructing masks to hide it, not only from others, but from themselves. They create images of goodness, righteousness, charm, or innocence, all while keeping the darker truths buried beneath layers of denial. Yet the shadow cannot be erased. It waits patiently beneath the surface, pressing against the walls of the unconscious, longing to be seen. When the empath stops forgiving endlessly, when they cease to absorb and erase the consequences of others' actions, the shadow that has been hidden finally emerges. Forgiveness without limit acted as a veil, protecting the offender from themselves, covering their impulses with the illusion of acceptability. But once that veil is lifted, the shadow is revealed in its raw form. The traits that were long disguised, selfishness, manipulation, cruelty, dishonesty, come forward, often violently. What was hidden can no longer be denied. This revelation is uncomfortable, both for the one whose shadow is exposed and for the empath who must witness it. The person confronted by their own darkness often lashes out because facing the shadow threatens the fragile identity they have built. To admit to manipulation is to lose the mask of kindness. To admit to betrayal is to abandon the image of loyalty. To admit to cruelty is to forfeit the illusion of innocence. Such truths are unbearable to the ego, which seeks always to preserve its ideal image. Thus, when the shadow emerges, denial, anger, and projection often follow. The empath, standing firm, becomes the unwilling witness to this eruption. Where once they shielded others from themselves, they now allow the truth to stand uncovered. This is not done out of cruelty, but out of necessity. For to continue forgiving endlessly is to participate in a lie, to collude with the illusion that the shadow does not exist. But to stop forgiving, to let the consequences of actions fall where they must, is to open the door through which the shadow steps into the light. It is a painful process, yet it is the only way for authenticity to be born. The shadow revealed is not evil in itself. It is not some demonic force separate from the person, but rather the disowned part of their humanity. In every soul there is light and darkness, nobility and selfishness, tenderness and cruelty. What makes the shadow destructive is not its existence, but its repression. That which is denied grows stronger in the dark. Lies multiply when they are hidden. Wounds fester when they are ignored. By refusing to acknowledge their shadow, a person becomes enslaved to it. Only when it is revealed can integration begin. For the empath, this moment is both liberating and heartbreaking. They may grieve for the image they once believed in, for the bond that seemed purer than it was. They may feel the sting of betrayal, the weight of disillusionment, the sorrow of seeing the truth where once they saw only potential. Yet within this grief lies wisdom. The empath learns that love cannot mean protecting another from their own shadow. To truly love is to allow the other to confront what they have denied, even if it costs the relationship, even if it breaks the illusion of harmony. When the shadow is revealed, there is no guarantee of growth. Some will face it with courage, accepting their flaws, acknowledging their wounds, and beginning the hard work of integration. For such souls, the breaking of illusion becomes the beginning of transformation. They discover a depth they never knew, a humility that softens their arrogance, a self-awareness that frees them from destructive patterns. Others, however, will resist. They will deny the shadow, blame the empath, or flee from the mirror that shows them what they are. These are the ones who would rather remain fragmented, clinging to illusions, even at the cost of their own wholeness. The empath cannot control which path is chosen. Their role is not to decide whether the other embraces their shadow or rejects it. Their role is only to refuse to carry it for them any longer. By stepping back, by ending the cycle of endless pardon, they allow the truth to be seen, and in doing so, they free themselves from the burden of deception. The revelation of the shadow is not limited to the other. The empath, too, must face their own. For in their endless forgiveness, they often find a hidden shadow of their own, fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, a need to be needed, a desire to be seen as good at all costs. In protecting others from their darkness, they were also protecting themselves from their own. When they stop, when they allow the shadow to emerge, they too must confront the ways they betrayed themselves, the ways they sacrificed authenticity for the illusion of peace. This mutual unveiling is painful, but it is also the birth of wholeness. To reveal the shadow is to return to reality. No longer can the relationship be sustained by illusions or masks. What is real, however flawed, stands in the open. And though this truth may be ugly, it is alive. It breathes with authenticity, with the possibility of transformation. The shadow, once revealed, can no longer control from the dark. It can be faced, wrestled with, understood, and integrated. And in this integration lies the possibility of becoming whole. Liberation for the empath does not arrive with noise or spectacle. It comes quietly, like dawn breaking after a long night, subtle yet irreversible. For so long the empath has carried the burdens of others, believing that love meant absorbing pain, that forgiveness meant erasing harm, that compassion meant silence. They lived in the shadows of others' needs, convinced that their worth was measured by how much they could endure. But the day comes when this cycle no longer holds, when the endless giving without balance collapses under its own weight. In that collapse, something extraordinary is born, the liberation of the empath. This liberation begins with a single radical act, saying no. The empath, who once believed that to deny was to betray love, discovers that refusal can be an expression of truth. No longer do they pardon betrayals as though their own dignity were disposable. No longer do they excuse manipulation as if silence were kindness. No longer do they wear themselves down to preserve a harmony that was never real. With each no, a chain is broken, a piece of their spirit reclaimed. It is not anger that drives them, but clarity. The clarity that love without boundaries is not love at all, but self-erasure. The liberation of the empath is not about hardening the heart. It is not the death of compassion, as those who benefited from their endless forgiveness often accuse. Rather, it is the rebirth of compassion in its truest form. They begin to understand that compassion that destroys the self is not compassion, it is complicity. To constantly shield others from truth is not love, it is collusion with illusion. Real love, they now see, is honest. Real kindness does not hide consequences but allows them to unfold. Real compassion honors the dignity of both souls, not just one. The empath's liberation is also a liberation from illusion. For years, they were entangled in masks, in stories spun by those who depended on their silence. They believed words that did not match actions, excuses that covered patterns, promises that never transformed. They looked at others not as they were, but as they might become, projecting hope onto shadows. In their liberation, they stop living in possibility and begin living in reality. They no longer love the mask, the potential, or the illusion. They love what is real, even when it is flawed. And in doing so, they themselves become real, no longer bound to a fantasy of eternal saviorhood. This awakening is not without grief. The empath feels the weight of lost time, the sorrow of recognizing how much of themselves they gave away, the ache of bonds that were never mutual. Liberation requires mourning, for to reclaim oneself means letting go of the illusions that once defined one's identity. They must grieve the version of themselves that was always the forgiver, always the healer, always the silent bearer of others' shadows. Yet within this grief is a profound joy, for what dies in that process is not the self, but the chains around it. As they step into this new freedom, the empath discovers an unfamiliar but exhilarating strength. They learn to stand in their truth without apology. They learn that silence is not always virtue, that boundaries are not cruelty, that self-respect is not selfishness. They feel their own presence again, their own desires, their own voice, their own light. Where once they were defined by the needs of others, they now begin to define themselves. Their life is no longer shaped by the endless demands of those who exploited their giving nature, but by the authenticity of their own soul. This liberation also changes the way they love. No longer do they seek to rescue or to redeem. No longer do they confuse pity with love or submission with harmony. Their love becomes deeper, stronger, and more discerning. They give not from compulsion, but from choice. They forgive not to erase truth, but to honor it. They care not because they are expected to, but because they desire to. Love ceases to be a burden and becomes instead a sacred exchange rooted in equality. The empath's liberation is frightening to those who once depended on their silence. When the endless source of pardon dries up, when the soft shield that absorbed all consequences is withdrawn, those around them must face themselves. They can no longer rely on the empath to play the role of silent redeemer. They must confront the weight of their own actions, the reality of their own shadows. Some will rage, some will accuse, some will flee. Yet others, humbled by the truth, may grow. And while the outcomes vary, the empath no longer defines themselves by those outcomes. Their freedom lies in knowing they are no longer responsible for carrying what was never theirs to bear. In this new state of being, the empath comes to understand a truth that had long been hidden from them, that their gift was never meant to be used for their own destruction. Their ability to feel deeply, to love intensely, to forgive sincerely, these are not weaknesses, but sacred capacities, yet they are sacred precisely because they must be guarded. A gift that is endlessly exploited becomes a curse, but a gift that is offered with wisdom becomes a light. The empath, in their liberation, learns to hold their gift with reverence, offering it only where it can truly heal. This liberation is not a single moment, but a lifelong unfolding. It begins with the courage to stop forgiving endlessly, but it continues with the daily practice of honoring one's truth, of setting boundaries, of choosing authenticity over illusion. It is a journey of becoming whole again, of uniting compassion with strength, love with truth, tenderness with self-respect. And though the path is not easy, it is sacred, for in walking it the empath discovers what they were always meant to be, not a vessel for others' shadows, but a light that shines with its own unbroken flame. When the empath stops forgiving, it is not the end of kindness, it is the rebirth of truth. The fall of masks is not destruction, but revelation. And in this revelation, the empath no longer lives as a mirror for others' illusions, but as a light of authentic being. The world may tremble when the empath ceases to be endlessly merciful, but in that tremble, a new order is born, where compassion and strength walk hand in hand.